as you've heard, I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Shroud of Turin Research Project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin. So there it is. That's that piece of cloth that got into my life 35 years ago. Well, as a professional photographer, I specialized in scientific, medical, and technical kinds of issues. So I had the skills and the qualifications that were necessary to be a part of the team that examined the shroud. But when they, when they first asked me to do this, the first thing I said was no way. And why did I refuse? Well, the answer is simple. I was very uncomfortable with the subject matter because I was born and raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. Now, I want to be clear about that. I am not a practicing Jew at this point in my life, but I was for that first 13 years. Both my parents immigrated to America from Poland, and when they were little kids, just before World War II. And so my question, and the question that went through my mind at the time, was why would a Jewish man want to get involved with this, what is probably, arguably, the most important relic of Christianity? At that moment in my life, I couldn't see any benefit to being involved. Well, not only that, I was a total skeptic and figured that the shroud was probably some form of a painting, which was the conventional wisdom in 1978. I fully expected to get to Turin, take a quick look, see the paint and the brushstrokes, and go home. I even stupidly said that publicly somewhere. And of course, for the last 35 years, I've been living to regret those words. Anyway, in the end, I viewed this whole thing, this was going to be a free trip to Italy. That's what I thought. In the end, of course, I did join the team because the image on the shroud has some fascinating properties that piqued my scientific curiosity. But I still tried to quit twice again. And in fact, as our team grew, a few men from the Jet Propulsion Labs became members of our team. One of them was a man named Don Lind, may he rest in peace. Don was an imaging expert from NASA, so he was my hero immediately. So I am pretty sure that any professional photographer given that opportunity would have been honored to be a member of that team. But I remember asking Don at one point during our planning, we planned for 19 months before we came to Turin to examine the shroud. I remember asking him, I said, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team? And Don, who was a good Catholic, looked me right in the eye and he said, have you forgotten that the man in question was a Jew? And I said, no, Don, that's probably the only thing I knew about Jesus, that he was a Jew. And then he said, and of course this is where Don, I think God was speaking to me through his lips, he looked at me and he said, oh, so you don't think God would want one of his chosen people on our team? And I laughed. I said, no, Don, I never thought that. And so then Don gave me what perhaps may be the best advice I've ever been given. He said, Barrie, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know. You know, and on those words, I stayed on that team. Don was right, and I've never regretted taking his advice and staying on that team. Now, the test we performed went on over the years that we did it and then evaluated it, went on to ultimately prove that the shroud was not a painting, not a scorch, or not a photograph. These were the kind of conventional wisdom things that people had, and so all the tests that we planned basically were to test for those kinds of things. At the end of our team, at the end of our 3 years, we published our work in peer-reviewed scientific journals, but ideally, we went there to answer the question, how is the image formed? That was our primary purpose. And in the end, however, we could not determine an image formation mechanism that could make an image with the properties on the Shroud of Turin. Our collective work still forms the primary database of literature that exists in the peer-reviewed science that points to the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. However, even with all that, it still took another 18 years before I was convinced. But in 1995, after years of actually resistance on my part, world-renowned blood expert Dr. Alan Adler, who was truly maybe the foremost blood expert in the world, and also Jewish, I might add, was on the phone with me, and he answered the final question that had kept me from accepting the Shroud as authentic. I was on the phone with him. I wasn't convinced the Shroud was real because the blood on the Shroud is still red. And old blood is supposed to turn black or brown, sometimes just within a matter of hours. And that really stopped me. Al then looked at me over the phone. He didn't look at me, but he spoke to me and he said, Barrie, he said, I found this large amount of bilirubin in the blood. Now, somebody who's been tortured like Jesus was, beaten the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane, then the next day scourged and ultimately capped with a capper crown of thorns, ultimately crucified and speared. People who have been tortured that way usually go into shock. The liver floods the bloodstream with bilirubin, and Al told me that blood of that nature stays red forever. Suddenly and unexpectedly, I realized that the last bit of evidence had come in, and I had no choice but to accept that the Shroud was authentic. So I was left with only one conclusion, that this cloth could only be the authentic burial shroud of the historic Jesus. There were probably 1 billion people on this planet who had more right to be in that room than I did. And yet, there I was in 1978, God dragging me, kicking and screaming, keeping me on that team. And at that moment in time, I realized that it brought with it a great responsibility, this privilege I had been given. And it was something of an epiphany, because I finally came to realize that I wasn't in that room for me. I was in that room for you. Now, I knew the truth about the Shroud and was frustrated because my Christian brothers and sisters were not getting that truth. And to me, all of our team members had always been doing this simply about the truth. I truly believe that only God would think to choose a Jewish man who had no emotional attachment to Jesus, who was a total skeptic, and with a pretty negative attitude, I might add, and put him on that team. Now, ironically, I've learned that as a child that the Jews were a chosen people. I've heard that since I was a little kid. I never felt very chosen. But now I do. Because of the Shroud, for the first time in my life, I get it. And yet, all God asked me to do, and it's very simple, tell the truth, Barrie. Isn't it funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger? I'm the messenger. So with that thought, all I can say, how many Jews can claim that it was the Shroud of Turin that brought them back to their faith in God? I can.